All right, guys, this is going to cover chapter 9, the muscular system. There is a lot of material in this chapter, so bear with me as we work our way through it. It's going to cover both the anatomy and physiology of the muscular system. So we're going to talk about the physiology, or how the muscular system works, which is a pretty difficult concept. And then the easier part of it is just the muscles you need to know. So that'll be at the end. So first we're going to cover this kind of a little bit more in depth about the muscular system. This first few slides should be a little bit of a review. We have 600 muscles in the body. It accounts for about 40% of adult body weight. Muscle's main job is to transform energy into motion. Everything our mind conceives is transmitted to your muscles to perform. And even things our mind doesn't conceive. I gave the example of putting your hand on a hot stove. Your nervous system tells your brain that there's something hot, and then it triggers your muscles to pull your arm away. So that's even something we don't think about. What should be a review here is these 3 types of muscles. So we have cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. So this was just covered last week, but we will refresh it here again. Cardiac, only found in the heart. Involuntary, right? We don't have any control over this. The heart is just beating, thank goodness. We don't want to have to think about that all the time. Consists of short branching fibers that fit together in these intercalated discs. It does appear striped or striated under microscope, but it is a little bit different than skeletal muscle in how it looks because of these discs that are in between. Smooth muscle, again, is not voluntary. We don't have any control over this. It's found in the digestive tract, blood vessels, bladders, airways, uteruses, and it's non-striated, which is why it's called smooth muscle. The autonomic nervous system actually has control over this. Skeletal muscle, on the other hand, is attached to bone and causes movement of the body. So we're going to talk mostly about skeletal muscle for the rest of the lecture. And then when we talk about those other different systems, we'll talk about the muscles there. But we are going to talk about skeletal muscle the most. This is what causes movement. It appears striated under a microscope, so you might also hear it called striated muscle. So let's talk a little bit about what this muscle is and the muscle structure. So we actually have a muscle fiber here, and that's actually like one muscular cell. That's covered by the endomysium. Then we have the fascicle, which is a group of muscle fibers together, covered by the perimysium. Okay, and we have a whole bunch of those in one long grouping together. So it's just kind of like one groups together to make a small group, and then the small groups come together to make one large kind of muscle fiber. So this whole thing here is considered a muscle fiber. Most fibers are about 1.5 inches long and about 1/500th of an inch wide. So very, very small in width, but quite a bit longer in length. Muscle fibers are grouped in bundles called fascicles. So that's where we get this here, this fascicle here. Okay. And then the connective tissue here, we get this kind of fascia that actually grabs a hold of the muscle and actually becomes tendon, which holds the muscle to the bone. So your book does talk about direct and indirect. So this would be indirect, where we have this tendon. Direct would be muscle right to bone. But not something you need to concentrate a ton on, but just understand the difference there. You do need to know muscle fiber is a cell covered by the endomysium. Fascicle is a group of them together, covered by the perimysium, and then all of this comes together to create one muscle fiber, okay? We're going to show a little bit more detail about that one cell. So this is one cell. You see this picture here? It's showing you what we're seeing now in more detail. It's this one muscle cell, okay? This one cell is covered by a membrane called the sarcolemma, okay? The cytoplasm of the cell, which is inside here, is called sarcoplasm, kind of like cytoplasm, right? So that might help you remember it. Then we have long protein bundles called myofibrils. They fill the sarcoplasm. They store glycogen and oxygen, which is going to help with muscle movement, okay? Then we have the myofilaments, which are actually even finer fibers, and they're actually inside the myofibrils, and there's 2 types of myofilaments. We have thick myofilaments. They're made of a protein called myosin, and we have thin myofilaments consisting of a protein called actin. And the arrangement of the actin and the myosin gives the skeletal muscle its actual striated appearance, okay? So we're going to show this in a little bit more depth on the other cells, so hopefully we can get a better idea. So here you can see we have alternating thin and thick myosin filaments. We have one kind of sarcomere here. It's showing you, okay? And I'm going to show you an animation about how muscle contraction actually happens, because that's what we really need to know here is how, what is this muscle fiber made of? But most importantly, how does it contract and relax? Because that's what our skeletal muscles really do. So let's watch that animation and then we can discuss it in a little bit more detail. And there's going to be a few animations here.
Skeletal muscle consists of bundles of tiny myofibrils that run the length of the muscle. Myofibrils consist of even finer fibers called myofilaments. They are arranged in a type of latticework to form units called sarcomeres. There are two types of myofilaments, thin and thick. Thick myofilaments are made of a protein called myosin, whereas thin myofilaments consist of a protein called actin. Thin myofilaments are attached to Z-discs. When a muscle begins to contract, the myosin heads latch onto the actin myofilaments, forming what is known as a cross bridge. The myosin heads propel the actin myofilaments forward toward the center of the sarcomere. Because the actin myofilaments are attached to the Z-discs, they pull the Z-discs closer together, shortening the sarcomere. As the sarcomere shortens, so does the myofibril and the entire muscle. Keep in mind that the myofilaments do not shorten. They stay the same length. The sarcomere shortens because the filaments slide over the top of one another.
Right, so what he's saying is these things do not actually change in length. This isn't changing in length, and this isn't changing in length. What is changing is this gap here in the middle. These here are pulling these parts here closer together, closing this gap. If you have a whole bunch of sarcomeres on that muscle fiber doing that, it's going to make the whole entire muscle fiber get shorter. Okay, so we have the thin filament, the thick filament. The thick filament has these little heads on it, okay, that kind of reach out and grab the thin filament, creating that cross bridge. They keep throwing these thin filaments closer together, shortening this sarcomere here. So a whole bunch of these sections are doing that, which in joined together will create a whole muscle shortening or becoming together as a muscle contraction. So that's what actually happens, but what makes that happen? So this is like the chemical processes behind it that actually makes the muscle contraction happen. So again, I want to show you the animation on this, but pay attention because there's a lot of things that happen here. We get things being released, things causing other things to change, and you really do have to know what happens here. A couple of big points are that we have to have calcium and we have to have ATP. So both of those things are going to play a huge role in this muscle contraction.
A skeletal muscle must be stimulated by a nerve, specifically a motor neuron, to contract. The connection between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber is called a neuromuscular junction. Between the end of the motor nerve and the muscle fiber is a narrow space called the synaptic cleft. When an impulse reaches the end of a motor neuron, it causes small vesicles to release a chemical messenger or neurotransmitter called acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine quickly diffuses across the synaptic cleft, where it stimulates receptors in the sarcolemma, the membrane surrounding the muscle fiber. In turn, this sends an electrical impulse over the sarcolemma and inward along the T-tubules. The impulse in the T-tubules causes the sacs in the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. The calcium binds with the troponin on the actin filament to expose attachment points. In response, the myosin heads of the thick filaments grab onto the thin filaments and muscle contraction occurs. When nerve impulses stop arriving at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is no longer released. Calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. With the calcium removed, troponin and tropomyosin again prevent the myosin heads from grasping the thin filament, and the muscle fiber relaxes.
Right, so the animation we saw last time actually showed how this happens here, right? Those Myosin kind of heads, grasp the thin filament, and throw it kind of forward, shortening that gap. Okay, making that contraction happen. But this is what actually triggers it, right? So this is the nervous system here that's secreting acetylcholine, stimulating an electrical impulse down the T tubules. The sarcoplasmic reticulum releases the calcium, which goes over here and actually makes those little gaps for the myosin heads to grab a hold of. So it's a whole process here of the nervous system telling those fibers to contract. So lots going on here, okay? So spend some time really thinking about this, watching these animations, looking at this, reading your book, and understanding what's really happening here and writing down the steps of what's happening here, okay? So you can really understand what's happening in each section. Muscle tone is important too, because the strength of contraction depends on the length of the fibers before the contraction starts. So optimal resting tone looks like this, right? We have this thick filament here. We have the thin filaments. We have a nice little gap in between. That's going to allow for a nice contraction. If that gap is already closed or it's short, are we going to get very good muscle contraction? No, that muscle is kind of already overly contracted, or we have like too much muscle tone. On the other hand, overly stretched, this gap is too far. So even though they're pulling it closer, you're still not going to get good muscle contraction. So we want to keep our muscles at this kind of optimal resting length so we have actually good muscle tone, right? The nervous system constantly is monitoring this, stimulating muscle fibers just enough to achieve that optimal resting length. And that is actually called muscle tone. So our body is working at that all the time. And it's really important because if we don't have good muscle tone, are you going to be able to react to a situation quickly and run or pull your arm away or whatever? If you don't have good muscle tone, you're not going to be able to contract your muscles very well. So you won't be able to react in those situations. And we certainly don't want that to happen. So a couple other things related to contraction of a muscle. We have to have a motor unit. So that's a neuron and all of the fibers it stimulates. That's one motor unit. It can consist of a few to a few hundred fibers, okay? And we have to have this threshold, this minimum voltage needed to cause muscle fiber contraction. It's the minimum amount of stimuli coming from the nervous system to make a muscle contract. A twitch is just a single brief contraction, right? We've all had a twitch, but it usually doesn't cause us to have a significant muscle contraction. What we have to have is all the muscles have to contract at the same time to make there actually be muscle movement. So a twitch is just like a small degree of muscle movement. The force of contraction is affected by a lot of things. The size of the muscle, the degree of stretch, right, or the muscle tone, and the number of muscle fibers contracting. There are lots of different things that give us an idea of how our muscles are going to contract throughout our body. Other factors, again, are the frequency of stimuli. So what happens sometimes is we actually get too much stimuli, and then that nervous system is going to kind of dull that stimuli. So our muscle is going to get weaker, or it's going to stop contracting as fast, and we're not going to get the chance to completely relax before the next impulse arrives. This is kind of like when you're lifting weights, right? Doing it a lot, our muscles are going to get weak and we're not going to be able to do it. The strength of the stimuli as well. So a stronger stimuli excites more nerve fibers and more motor units. So we're going to get a bigger reaction. We have a bigger stimuli from the nervous system. The type of contraction also is important. We need to know the difference between isometric and isotonic. Isometric is basically like pulling on a cable fastened to a stationary object. So you're not changing the length of that cable at all. You're just increasing the tension on that cable. Isotonic, on the other hand, actually changes the length of wherever you're moving. So you actually do get some change there, but the tension stays the same. So this is like lifting a barbell, right? So you can actually move that barbell from one place to another, but the tension stays the same. So they're actually opposite if you can think about that and think about the difference there. So one is pulling on a cable that's fastened. So you're not actually changing the length of it. You're just putting a lot of tension in that cable. On the other hand, doing the exact opposite. So when you're moving a barbell, you actually are moving and changing the distance, but the tension on that barbell or on that muscle stays exactly the same. One of the other harder concepts here before we talk about the muscles in the actual body is how do we actually get this energy for contraction? So all muscle contractions requires energy in the form of ATP. We learned about ATP in the beginning of this course. Muscles, however, only store a very small amount of ATP. That's going to be used up really, really quickly. So we have to figure out another way to get energy to our muscles so that they can continue contracting. So there's 3 ways in which we do that: fatty acids, creatine phosphate, and glucose. And we're going to talk about these 3 different things. Okay. What happens is first, at rest, muscles obtain most ATP by metabolizing fatty acids. So we break down fatty acids, we get ATP, right? We have lots of oxygen because we're at rest. So we use the process of aerobic respiration to break down fatty acids for ATP. This is what happens continuously when we're at rest. When we're not at rest, though, as we continue to move and exercise continues, the demand for oxygen increases. Muscles are going to quickly break down creatine phosphate to restock ATP because we're going to run out of the ATP that's already in our muscles very quickly. We're also going to run out of oxygen very quickly, or not run out, but the oxygen in our muscles is going to decrease, right? Because we're exercising. So we have enough creatine phosphate to last for about 20 seconds of high energy activity or 1 minute of moderate exercise. So not a ton, but we got about 20 seconds to a minute here of creatine phosphate that we can use to restock the ATP so our muscles can keep contracting. After that, what happens is we get anaerobic without oxygen. That's what anaerobic means, respiration. The creatine phosphate is exhausted before we have enough oxygen left to restock ATP. So the muscles switch to anaerobic respiration of glucose. So glucose in the bloodstream and some stored in the muscle is glycogen, okay, is broken down. It produces lactic acid, which is a byproduct, and leads to muscle fatigue. That's why we actually get muscle soreness and muscle cramping the next day, because eventually we converted to this anaerobic respiration. But we needed to get ATP. So first we use oxygen. Oxygen makes ATP. We run out. Our oxygen gets a little bit lower, so we run out of ATP. We use creatine phosphate, okay, to create ATP so our muscles can keep contracting. Eventually, after about 20 seconds or a minute, that runs out. We still don't have enough oxygen restored in our muscles, so we switch to this anaerobic respiration of glucose. We break down glucose to make ATP, but we don't really like to do this because then we get this byproduct of lactic acid. Okay, so this isn't ideal for us, right? What then happens, and this is the most ideal, is after about 10 minutes of moderate activity, our lungs have had a chance to really work harder and get caught up and get enough oxygen supply back to the muscles. So our muscles can again start producing ATP. And now the byproducts of this is only carbon dioxide and water. So we don't get that lactic acid buildup. So this is the most ideal situation, is exercising for about 10 minutes. That's why sometimes when people lift weights or do those types of things, they get a lot of soreness in their muscles, and that's related to lactic acid because they don't actually exercise to get to this point of aerobic respiration, okay? But we want aerobic respiration because our body really likes those byproducts better than lactic acid, okay? So lots of information there, all right? So spend some time. You're going to have to listen to this a couple times probably, read the book a couple times, come to class, all right? These last couple of slides really are the easier part. I'm going to tell you which muscles you need to know, and this part is just really going to be kind of straight memorization. Right, so we have muscle function, okay? We have the primary mover, the antagonist, and the synergist, okay? What happens is all these work in a group to create movement. The main muscle triggering the movement is the primary mover. The muscles that assist are called synergists. And the muscles that balance these movements or move in the opposite direction are called antagonists. So antagonists must relax, give the primary mover control, okay? And then the primary mover is going to relax and the antagonist is going to contract, okay? And that's what happens in your arms, your legs, throughout most of your body. So the major muscles of the body are named according to size, shape, location, direction of muscle fibers, actions, all of those different things. If you look on page 138 in your book. You can see how muscles are named. I do not need you to memorize all of these things, but it might help you in memorizing the ones that I do need you to know, okay? So if you look on this number of origins, biceps, triceps, 2 origins, 3 origins, it'll help you to understand a little bit better about why we named those muscles the way that we did. So we get the muscles of the head and the neck. The one I really want you to know here is the masseter, okay? And that's really going to help with the jaw. And it helps to close the jaw, so it's really how we eat and kind of chew food.